Among the best known of the groups, there will be the Shabab 6th of April, which is emerged as Egypt's largest pro-democracy youth group. And in April, the group staged a countrywide protest that led to some crackdowns by the government that led to some arrests and even deaths. And some of the leaders were tortured, severely beaten, and an effort that backfired somewhat when pictures of their injuries were posted online. It's actually a good piece about this group in the current issue, or last month's issue of Wired, and we will have some members from this group coming as well. I'll talk about Invisible Children.
There's another organization that I would imagine a number of you are familiar with called Invisible Children, which creates awareness about some of the atrocities committed by the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. There's an organization called Fight Back coming from India, which has a phenomenal online model for creating awareness and pushing back on domestic violence challenges in India. There's the Save Darfur Coalition, which, as you all know, has a tremendous presence online. There's an organization called 1 Million Voices Against Crime in South Africa, which is actually modeled to some extent off of the Million Voices Against FARC movement. There's an organization out of the UK called the People's March Against Knife Crime, which is organized by two young women and has organized marches in the, I think, about 5,000 or 6,000. There's an organization out of Lebanon called Youth for Tolerance, which is a relatively new organization. It doesn't have the numbers online that, say, Million Voices Against FARC has, but it's doing some of the more interesting things online, and their mission is to try to address sectarian issues. There's an organization called Young Civilians, which has about 2 million members.
Turkey?
Yeah, that's out of Turkey. There's an organization called Illuminemos Mexico, which is pushing back on crime and violence in Mexico. And then there's an organization called Genocide Intervention Network, which uses the online world to create awareness about atrocities that could eventually lead to genocide. So it's really a diverse set of groups from a diverse set of countries. The type of violence that are addressing is everything from terrorism to domestic violence to a range of other issues. What we're looking for is to convene, the best case studies of organizations that have used successful online models to push back on various forms of violence.
What is the Turkish? What do they do? Turkish group, Young Civilians.
The organization Young Civilians, they began online in 2006. And they're a pro-reform, pro-democracy, pro-human rights organization that's driven by a couple young kids in their early 20s, and they've grown pretty quickly in the last couple of years. And most of the work that they do is online, but they've actually undertaken some pretty impressive marches in Turkey that have put thousands of people into the streets.
And they've also tried to bring Armenians and Turks together. Let me just add one thing before we take more questions. During my confirmation hearings back in January, I made the comment that Al-Qaeda was eating our lunch on the Internet. I actually think that has changed, and that the violent extremist groups that use the Internet are using it in the old-fashioned way. They're using it to instruct, to exhort, basically tell people what to do. We feel that around the world, young people are using the Internet to push back against violence in a new way, using social networking, convening large groups to have conversations, basically, to share information. And this is something that Al-Qaeda and the violent extremist groups cannot stand. They cannot stand criticism. Sometimes they'll post videos on YouTube until YouTube takes them down, and they get tremendous amounts of critical comments. They don't want that. Their whole philosophy is based on trying to isolate potential members and keep them away from critical comment, from discussion. So we want to take exactly the opposite tack, and we think that the technology that exists today is on our side. It's not on the extremist side.
I don't see any sign, though, of those kinds of groups yet among those you mentioned. I don't see the anti-terrorist groups Is there one from Jordan? I know there was a big backlash against the bombings that hit the weddings at these hotels, but among those groups I don't hear any anti-terrorist groups.
That's a good point, and the reason for that is that those groups do not have an online presence or a significant online presence at this point. And what we hope to do through this conference is to get young people interested in those places, informing such groups. And we are going to have observers who have organizations that don't have much in the way of an online presence but are interested in having such a presence.